Welcome to Beyond the Ballot AZ. I'm your host, Tom Collins, Executive Director of the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Commission.
And I'm Gina Roberts, Voter Education Director for Clean Elections.
So today we're talking about all those campaign street signs that we drive by every day and are definitely a staple of campaign season.
Definitely a staple, Tom. They're everywhere. They're hard to miss, but that's on purpose, right? They impact the local economy, and there's a lot of thought that goes into them, whether it's the design or maybe a slogan. It's that campaign sign that you might be driving by right now as you're listening to us. It's the topic of today's show.
You know, they also, I think, are so good at making sure that everyone knows there's an election coming up, right? I mean, it's like we will get calls, I think, pretty regularly to office from a voter who says, I saw this sign, especially in a local election, like a school board or a school bond, right? They'll see the sign, they call up, they say, I want to make sure that I'm signed up for this election, if I'm eligible, those kinds of things.
That's true. Yeah, it definitely is, one of those first touch points, I think, that voters come across where it's signaling, hey, it's election season right now. And especially if they see a candidate's name that they want to support, they might be reaching out. So they do serve a lot of purposes.
I think the other thing that's kind of interesting, and I'm curious for your take on this, is, some people hate them. And I can't decide if that's an internet thing where if you go on Facebook or your whatever you post on and say, gosh, I hate these signs, they're always in the way and they're terrible. Is that, but nevertheless, so what's your take? Like, are you generally pro-sign, anti-sign? Do you think they're ugly?
I think it is impacted simply because of my job that I like them. So if I did not work in elections, I probably would not like the political signs. But because I do, and because I'm literally talking to practically every single one of those candidates, and so, I've been communicating with them, whether it's for our debates or our voter guide, it's always interesting to me to see, oh, hey, I just emailed that person yesterday, and then here's their sign. Oh, that's the sign they chose. So I have a little bit more of, I think, a connection to them with just, so I enjoy that aspect of seeing the signs that they put out.
Well, all that and more about how to reach grassroots voters at the grassroots level on this show. We're here with Tim Riester, founder and CEO of Riester, a privately owned advertising and public relations agency based in Phoenix. Tim, thanks for joining the show.
Tom, thank you for having me.
So, your agency has worked on all sorts of mass media campaigns in the Southwest, and some of those have been, government. I mean, the famous anti-tobacco ads of some of our youth, the smelly, puking habit ads.
Tobacco, tumor-causing, teeth-staining, smelly, puking habit.
But you've also worked on political campaigns for both parties, and today we want to talk a little bit about how you reach people at the grassroots, and especially where we are on the calendar. Everywhere across at least the valley and then around the state, we see street signs everywhere. So the question is, do those work?
I love them. And I say that with a huge smile because I know so many people are just disgusted by the amount of political signs. And it's interesting, in our industry, there's a lot of debate about whether they're really worth it anymore or not. I think they are. When you consider the cost per thousand, even though the cost of printing these signs continues to go up if you want them done well, it's, from my point of view, instead of just looking at the cost per sign, if you look at how minimal the cost is per person who drives by and sees those things. Now, you can't just do the same thing everyone else does and expect it to be super valuable. You need to find ways through color and imagery and phrasing to make them really stand out and provide a point of difference for either the ballot campaign, the referendum, or the candidate you're supporting. I'm still a big fan of the political signs.
So that's really hard to be different, though, because, your sign is there next to 5 other candidates or political campaigns, and there's only so much space. So, to be able to get that much information on there to make such an impact with somebody who's driving by, let's say 45 miles per hour, you really do have to be creative, I would think, to get that message across.
You do, Gina, and I'll share something I'm really proud of that if it's okay for me to mention an actual client we supported years ago. In 2014, Riester won the best political sign from the Capital Times Best of edition that year, from the whole political season that year. And it was a sign that we created for Fred Duvall's gubernatorial race. We created this phrase, "Get ahead with Fred." And it was just this picture of Fred's head and his shoulders, and we did a die cut. So instead of it being like a family portrait or something on a sign, which you see very commonly now, back then it was very rare to see a photo of a candidate. If you did, it usually was a photo of like a family or something. But to have a close-up photograph be the entire sign and be the shoulders and head cut out, we had them all over the state. And his face was so big that it attracted a lot of muralists. And so people were drawing, glasses on him or mustaches on him, which is illegal, by the way, but we knew they would, and it actually added to the campaign, because if the sign can change and evolve a little bit without you paying for that to happen, it draws more attention to the sign. So that's an example of a political sign that really was different than any others at the time.
It's interesting. You mentioned the phrase, "get ahead with Fred," and that kind of harkens back to, I don't know other than that if we've had one recently, but you had Nixon is the one, I like Ike, these kind of, seemingly ancient now time when we had these sort of efforts to capture the attention. And one of the things that goes with that is there used to be sort of more and different merchandise or stuff that candidates give away. Like for Barry Goldwater famously had AU H2O, and you could actually buy a can of Goldwater, which is a soda, but it was basically Mountain Dew. And those you can buy that on eBay today. But when you're working with those kind of things in the grassroots level, putting stuff out there, what are some of the things you're concerned about when you're talking to a candidate or a campaign?
Well, I think when you're doing merchandise, it's really helpful if you can brand the candidate or the issue, the referendum or bond or whatever you're doing, within the phrasing or the imagery or the creative concept of the merchandise. Otherwise, it just sort of is a throwaway and it blends in. I'll give you an example of one we did that I was also really proud of. Years ago, some of your listeners may remember a fabulous human being from Tucson named Dr. Andy Nichols. And he was in the House in Arizona, and he was assigned to the Tobacco Oversight Fund. I think he was appointed by the governor or the Speaker of the House at the time. So Riester had an opportunity to work with him and get to know him. And this guy was unbelievably bright and hardworking, and he decided to run for the Senate. And it was a redistricting year. So a lot of Republican friends of mine were really disappointed and upset with me when I said, we're going to help Andy and do his campaign. And with the last name Nichols, we absolutely had to use a nickel to do his button. And it was fun. We had all over the legislature, and his constituents in Tucson were all wearing these Nichols buttons everywhere. And it just helped people remember they met someone because a little button like that you can wear all day. It's not something you just wear, once. And it was a clip-on instead of a sticker. So people, the same way they wear an American flag on their lapel, they were wearing the Andy Nichols buttons throughout that, that whole several-month process. And bless his heart and soul, he won. And he ended up dying, unfortunately, shortly after that. But he died in his office working. That's just the way the man was. He was incredible.
Wow, that's quite the story. And speaking, Nichols, and speaking of money, you touched on this a little bit earlier, Tim, but can you take us back to the financial side of things? So when we think of political signs and grassroots advertising, just thinking about the kind of money that is pumped into the local economy for that, what does that look like? Because I think, when we're talking about presidential campaigns, obviously the dollars are much higher there, but for a legislative campaign, what does the financial side of that look like when it comes to these pins, these merchandising pens, bumper stickers, and political signs? What kind of dollars are those being pumped into our economy? What does that look like?
I think in mass, when you combine all the different campaigns, it can have a profound impact on the local merchandise vendors and the local printing companies. I think for an individual campaign, it doesn't have to represent a really large part of the budget. And I know often consultants will argue about, should we spend that much money on signs? But if you have a candidate who's relatively unknown, it's a nice way to generate awareness, especially if you have your act together operationally and you can be one of the signs going up earlier in the process. You're allowed 71 days to post a sign prior to the election, and then it has to come down within 15 days after the primary. Unless your candidate wins, it can stay up through the general. I think that and you'll see it now, the candidates who were able to post earlier, you drive by those corners and these signs can be anywhere there's a public right of way or on private property. They can't be anywhere where it could hinder public safety or it could prevent ADA access. So when you look at these corners where they're allowed, they get pretty crowded. So if you can get there earlier, it can really help. And then if you can do something with the color or the imagery to attract attention, I think it's a great way to generate awareness, especially for a new candidate. And in our market, many people around the country don't like signs because as soon as it rains, it can look not as attractive. Here, where the weather's so nice, a candidate can save these signs at the end of the season and reuse the ones that aren't torn up. So I think it's worth it for a campaign.
So those signs could really be that first impression to sort of get that name recognition. So, voters driving by, they see that sign and they think, oh, okay, maybe I'm going to look into this candidate a little bit more. Perhaps use the Clean Elections Voter Education Guide or check out a candidate debate. Or, if they just go straight to the ballot, they may have that recognition there. So it seems like those signs really do work.
Indeed. And Gina, you had asked me about cost. And people feel that, well, the quality of the signs have improved. The cost may go up if you're printing 4 color instead of 1 color. But if you look at the thousands of people who see it, if you look at cost per impressions instead of cost per printing, it's very affordable. And I think it's a very good investment for a campaign.
One question that we have, we spend a lot of time on the show talking about what younger voters are doing, how to reach them. At some point, there's a point at which everybody's going to be in a car that's being driven by a robot looking at their phone. So, will there be a time when we'll look back and say, we used to have these signs everywhere. I mean, what's the next thing, or what would be a thing if you were in that mindset of trying to get someone who doesn't have name ID? What's a thing you're looking at that's the functional equivalent of it?
The functional equivalent of a sign is probably geofencing digital communications. The nice thing about signs is you can pick the corners in the neighborhoods you're representing. And a lot of media, that's difficult. And historically, it used to be very difficult. Today, with texting, with geo-targeting, social media, and digital media, you can wrap your messaging digitally around the same neighborhoods that you used to only be able to reach with direct mail and signage. And it's very affordable. One of the benefits of digital media versus a sign is you can actually track who's clicking through. And so there's a level of efficacy there and responsibleness for a campaign. They can adjust a message. If they're not getting the clicks that they think they need, they can actually tweak it. It's really hard to do that with a sign, and you have no idea truly how many people saw your sign and went to your website.
So, once the election is over, who's responsible for taking those signs down? Tim, I know you said that they can stay up there for 15 days past the election, but sometimes it feels like they're still up there for quite a time. So, we want our streets clean. We want our neighborhoods clean. Is it the candidate that's responsible for it? Is the city coming in if the candidate doesn't do it? How does that work?
It's the candidate and their campaign's responsibility. They can be fined if they don't remove the sign within 15 days. I know for the neighbors around these corners, it feels like these things are just there forever and they can't wait to get them taken down. I think it reflects very poorly on a candidate or a campaign if they don't take it down on time. We historically always worked with off-duty firefighters or retired firefighters to handle the placement and removal of our signs at Riester. They knew the neighborhoods best. They knew the right-of-ways. They also knew public safety. And we felt doing that correctly from the beginning and not having a city council come to you or public safety coming to you to fix something helped our candidates succeed because it showed they were responsible and they knew the rules.
And all that rebar, that's not free, and that's definitely reusable.
It's all reusable, and it stays in storage sheds until the next campaign cycle.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for all this insight today. This has been great, and we really appreciate you joining Beyond the Ballot AZ.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Ballot AZ. I'm Gina Roberts.
And I'm Tom Collins. We'll see you next week.